probably not the best book for little kids, but.
Okay, we're at 100.
Okay, well, let's go. As soon as Steve's ready.
I'm ready, Joel.
All right. So good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who's joining us. It's lovely to see everybody rolling in from all around the world. I'm Joel Porter, and I'm here with a host of colleagues, friends, and people I'm looking forward to getting better to know, along with Steve. I'm here in Christchurch, New Zealand, and it's a lovely morning, and I'm just really looking forward to seeing where this conversation about change goes.
And Joe, we've got Denise Ernst and Molly Magill from the United States.
Yep.
Wonderful to see you. They should be on the screen. Colin McRae from probably Dublin, Colin?
Colin
Yeah.
Driscoll.
Okay. And we've also got Rick Cotgreave, who's in England.
That's right.
Yeah. So we've got a wonderful group of people who are going to help us. Joel, do you want to say anything by way of introduction, other than to introduce Angela, of course, who manages the whole process for us and is also quite engaged in motivational interviewing and learning the skills and things. So thanks, Ange.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
It's lovely to have you.
No, I don't have anything in particular in mind other than the usual format of starting a conversation and just seeing where it goes. And I'm really curious about this topic and what everybody here on the panel and in the audience has to say, and kind of where this topic came up from within you, Steve.
Yeah, and so we'll shortly start with these brief conversations with each of Denise and Molly and Colin. Rick will sit to one side and commentate because he's right outside of the field of motivational interviewing. And Joe, my feeling about this is that this question, what goes on in the conversation about change, we could easily imagine that there's quite a lot to say about this that's relatively certain, because books have been written about it, and between them, Molly and Denise have looked at like hundreds of consultations and done research. But I think the spirit of it was, maybe we don't know as much as we think we do. And a free-form conversation that is open to taking any of a number of different directions could well produce insights and developments that we weren't hitherto aware of.
Mm. Yeah. It's great that Molly and Denise and Colin are here, because when I sit down and I work with people, my first thought is usually what about that was good? What was helpful to you? And I'm sometimes quite surprised then it was helpful. Their experience is really. Is my internet dropping out?
Your internet's dropping off, Joel, but we did hear most of that, and I think we'll get going while you make an effort to fix it, eh?
Yeah, man, let's do that.
Good stuff, good stuff. Well, welcome everybody. And there were a couple of riders to this topic of what goes on in the consultation about change. When we just added them, like, where does hope come in? And what happens if a conversation about change is harmful, and why is that? How does that come about? And in Denise and Molly, I think it's, are two people who probably looked inside consultations about change more than anyone I've come across. And perhaps Denise and Molly, when we chat to each of you in turn, you can just say, who you are and what have you done by way of looking into the consultations in the last how many years? And then we'll have a chat with you. And I wonder whether we shouldn't start with you, Denise, I've known you for many decades, but Denise, can you tell us like who you are and if you imagine someone like Rick, who's next to you there on the screen, who doesn't know you, what would you say to somebody like Rick about what you've done by way of looking into consultations about change?
Yeah. You said it, Steve, actually. I've listened to thousands of interactions about change. My own research was about conversations and listening to conversations. And of course, as you probably don't know, Rick, but I have been involved in the actual development of the tools from the very beginning in motivational interviewing, of the tools to have a more objective way of evaluating the conversations. So was involved in the first coding system that we use, the MISC, that is driven, and actually that coding system has driven a lot of what you will hear from Molly also about what we know, what we do know, and what we don't know. So I've been involved in that process and thinking about that from the very from very early on, and I have to say that I have learned really a lot. I've learned so much and continue to learn so much from listening to those conversations and listening with a different ear and hearing how the conversations go and the tone and the things that happen in those conversations. So much so that I also include, I encourage all my students to listen to themselves, to listen to what they're doing and to pay attention to what they're doing and to learn their own process really deeply, learn what they're doing really deeply. And on this last call or the last webinar, when that issue came up about what we're really doing when we're training people in motivational interviewing or teaching people is that we're facilitating clinician change, that was really profound to me. I think that I see that happening in the teaching, and when I'm teaching, that you're helping people really reflect deeply and change themselves, change their practice, change their pay attention to what is being helpful, because it's pretty, when you're actually in an interaction with somebody, if you're really attending to it, you can pretty much tell if it's causing harm or being helpful or not. And most of the time we spend so much time in our heads that we don't always notice that, but I think we can train ourselves to do that. So I'm pretty fascinated by it, but
and I bet there've been some surprises along the way for you.
Yes, there definitely have been some surprises, and I don't know as much if it is a surprise as realizing what you don't often see when you're listening, when people are learning. So it just popped into my head as you said that the one of the biggest challenges in these conversations is getting any kind of focus, and how often. So one of the things I've done for many years now is to review the interactions that people applying for our new training for trainers do. And they have to submit a sample or have an interview that we evaluate and rate. And one of the biggest challenges for people was trying to find any kind of a focus or stay on focus. So I don't know if it surprised me, except for that realizing that it is a practice, and that you can't just teach the bubble sheet or the particular tool and then it happens. It's like it is that there's deep learning and deep practice that has to happen for these things to really come to fruition, for you to be able to focus a conversation and maintain and attend to that focus. So those kind of surprises, just about how much practice and how much self-reflection it takes to for people to really change their own practice to be more helpful. So I guess that kind of, it was not always surprising, but it did surprise me about just how deep that runs.
Yeah. And so there's an assumption in what you're saying that it's good to have a focus in a conversation about change.
Well, yeah, yes, actually, and that comes. I mean, there is research out there that indicates, and that is in the new effective counseling skills book, that having a focus really makes a difference, because you in terms of the outcome. So there is some out there, but what I really noticed in that regard, I worked with a large group that dealt with people with really complex problems. Most of them were houseless and had many substance abuse issues and mental health issues and financial issues and all kinds of stuff. And the conversations, what would end up happening was that the clinicians would have the same conversation over and over and over again, because they were being empathic, trying to really be empathic, but it was so hard to kind of corral that conversation into anything that might be helpful. And if we think of what might be helpful as something that helps the person move along in a way. So
Yes.
doing that, and the clients aren't very good at focusing themselves oftentimes, and so you're kind of modeling that process as you go. And but so I would say that from listening to so many sessions that did not feel helpful because they did not have a focus,
Yes.
that led me to my personal feelings about that. So
Yeah. It's very interesting. Yeah, like people are struggling to kind of make sense of a potentially chaotic conversation.
yes, yeah.
One of the things that surprised me, Denise, years and years ago, was a study I believe that you were a part of in Oregon with probation officers.
Yes.
When I think you and Bill Miller and other people were part of that. And I remember I was doing a training in Adelaide, Australia, and it was probably about the third training in MI I've ever done. And somebody pulled up that study. And in that study, it said that there were some surprise reactions to confrontation. That sometimes the probation officers would say something that would be confrontational, but the client's reply was more towards change. And the person asked me about that, and I said I didn't know. And I thought about it, I had some ideas, and I went back after the first day and I emailed Terry Moyers, and I said, what about this? And she said, what you also need to know is that spirit was high.
Yeah.
Right? There were good autonomy, collaboration, and evocation back in the day. Spirit was high, and in those instances, the confrontation wasn't seen so much as a confrontation, and that when spirit was low, there was more of the predicted response, which would be resistance, kind of the way discord is what it's been updated to. And that really surprised me, because one of the things that I took on board really quick about MI is the role of confrontation and to move away from that.
It wasn't that first study with probation officers. I don't believe it was a study that Bill and Terry primarily did, and I can't remember which one it was, but it was a little bit later than the probation study, but it was sort of like that. I don't know if they did a formal mediation analysis, but it was, if the spirit was there, and really, if the spirit's there and the empathy's high, you can get away with a lot.
Yes.
Okay.
basically.
Yeah. All right. Well, I've been lying to people for decades now, saying that.
That's all right.
Saying it was a study with
Denise,
probation officers,
what are-
particularly when I've been working with corrections. But anyway,
Well,
but
it
still,
probably could have
that
been
was
replicated in that population too.
but that was a surprise because it was kind of counterintuitive to motivational interviewing. But it makes sense so too at the same time. That if you have a good relationship with somebody, it can tolerate some stress.
Well, and you know, the in the first edition of the motivational interviewing book, there's that whole segment on confrontation not being the way you do it, but that it is the goal. And one of it could be part of the goal to have the person confront themselves, basically, to see that discrepancy. And in a way, you could think of, if a clinician is really engaged in understanding, they can reflect. It's almost a reflection of them confronting themselves, which could feel confrontational or might get coded that way. But if they're deep in that relationship, they might be reflecting that self-confrontation.
So part of a conversation about change might involve some sort of internal disruption.
Absolutely.
Well, I would also say that a good rule of thumb and part of the conversation about change is trying to work with clients in a way that we get them to do the therapeutic work for themselves rather than us imparting those techniques upon them. So, that getting the client to confront themselves, it's always going to be more powerful if it comes from them than if it comes from us. And that's a pretty good rule of thumb that we can kind of take away as far as if we're trying to put together, maybe a short list of some of the key ingredients or the key elements of the conversation about change. So.
Okay, I was just wondering that, and again, I was going to ask Denise a very confrontational question, but hopefully it's done in the right spirit, Denise. Let me just put it this way: there seems reasonable consensus between you, Joel, and Molly thus far. Colin's just kind of keeping his counsel. That motivational interviewing involves a conversation about change where you try and help the person to come to their own conclusions about why and how they might change, and that you would use curiosity and compassion and a few other things that you call spirit to help them to do this. Okay, I think that's reasonable, more or less. Okay, but that doesn't tell us what's happened in all the research that you've done, because there's an additional piece there which we've put together with you and with colleagues that Miller and I have put together, which is that when they do this, if they're talking about change in a positive way, and we call that change talk, if you like, they're more likely to change. And if they talk about change, about all the problems and difficulties, if you like, and we call that sustained talk, and Jeff Allison was the guy who came up with that phrase, which is why I'm hoping someone can spot him, that makes it less likely to change. Okay. Now, Denise, here's my direct confrontational question to you, right? Okay.
Go for it.
See what you and
Confrontation with a laugh.
Okay, Denise, here goes, right? Be interesting to see what Molly and Colin think. Do you really think that it is as simple as I've just described, that if you use empathic listening to evoke change talk, change will be more likely to occur, which suggests a simple linear relationship with a very easy roadmap to a conversation about change? And of course, there's the shadow side, which is if you spend your time eliciting sustained talk, the opposite will happen. Denise, do you think it's really as simple as that? That's my confrontational question.
Yeah. I think that at one level it is as simple as that. at the deeper, the more meaningful level, the conversations, it's like the idea that when you're having these conversations, you are co-creating that narrative or what is happening. So it's not just that you're getting change talk, it's that that you help the person create a more hopeful, change-oriented narrative about where they are, and it is a weaving together. And I'm going to mention David Rosengren here, who's on here, because in his workbook, the last edition of the workbook on MI skills, he has an absolutely fabulous definition of that and description of that co-creating, of how you're working that together. So it's not at that level, it's not as simple as like, are you going after the sustained talk, or are you going after the change talk? But are you actively working together with this person to create a helpful narrative for them about what's going on for them? Are you feeding it with hope? Are you seeing and expecting something good to come out of that? All of those things really matter when you're having that conversation.
And so you're quite influenced by constructivist thinking here in your references to co-creation and sharing and developing a narrative with someone. And one might even listen to what you're saying, Denise, and forget about what I just said about change talk and say, well, that's what the purpose of MI is. And if that's the purpose of MI, to co-create a path for change for someone, if I can caricature what you've said, then the research would have been quite different. The research wouldn't have looked at language about change. It would have looked at the process of co-creation. So I'm very puzzled, okay? But maybe
I think the language is a marker, though. I think, I mean, that's where at one level it's the simple notion is really good, because the language is, well, we don't know exactly if it's a marker, but that's my thinking about it, that the language is a marker. And if you listen to, if you listen to the change talk and learning how to pay attention to that, and then helping people really deepen that so that you have deeper markers, if you will. But the language is really a marker. And we have some ways of categorizing and labeling and identifying change talk, but I don't think we know all the answers about what the really deeper, meaningful language is. But it is, I believe it's a marker.
Yeah, that's a fabulous and succinct way of putting it, and integrating these two perspectives, the co-creation of a narrative with language. It's fabulous. Denise, if you don't mind, can we move on to Molly? Because I want to see if I can remember to ask Molly the same question, because it's
as long as you confront her too, I'll be okay.
And by the time I get to Colin, I'll be well oiled. I'll be super hot with this. But meanwhile, Molly, won't you tell us about your journey? And then I wanted to ask you about surprises, and I wanted to also make sure Joel gets a chance to chat to you, but he doesn't look unhappy with the way this is going, do you?
Not unhappy at all.
Good, okay.
My journey is coming from always an interest in addictions, but also always an interest in psychotherapy process research. So I came up studying defense mechanisms, watching short-term dynamic psychotherapy sessions, and watching and measuring emotional experiencing, and measuring changes in self-perception or perception of others, things like that. When I was hoping and praying to get into a postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University, I thought that I was going to be bringing process research to the addictions. So I thought it was my brilliant idea that addictions researchers actually hadn't thought of it yet. And then I discovered motivational interviewing and the process research that was occurring on motivational interviewing. And that really helped me to kind of bridge that gap in terms of the methodology that I was interested in. And not just methodology, but the goals of the work, which is to really understand, the machinery of psychotherapy as a way to hopefully improve psychotherapy or improve training. And so I went and worked with Dr. Tim Apodaca at Brown University. He was my postdoctoral mentor, and he was working on a process study of motivational interviewing at the time. And it was from that experience that I really started digging. I was doing motivational interviewing clinically because I had found as a clinician that if I needed to stop arguing and getting into power struggles with my clients, that I could switch to motivational interviewing and stop doing CBT, or what I thought was CBT at the time. So I totally knew what it was, but I didn't know that they were doing process research. So from there, I've done a lot of process studies, not only work, collaborating on process studies, but also conducting my own. And part of that is listening to thousands and thousands of hours of motivational interviews in the context of clinical trials. So that is a little different than, the real natural world. So that's where I'm coming from.
And before we go on to that, because I think it would be wonderful to explore with you how you feel about all those thousands of motivational interviewing tapes. I'm very curious to know when you cross that bridge over from psychodynamic process research into motivational interviewing in Brown. But if you look back at the psychodynamic stuff, was there any striking memories that you have about findings from the psychodynamic world?
I think very often you can, and maybe this is just because of that's what people study, but you can find often decent support for the purported ingredients, the elements of the theoretical model that say, well, this is why this treatment is beneficial and this is what is happening in the therapy room. If you study that, you can often find support for that. So for things like emotional experiencing and changes in self-perception, like how you view the self, how you view the world, you could almost consider those two steps in a causal chain, that those emotional, those corrective emotional experiences in session would potentially lead to a change of perception of the self or of one's, family history or whatever.
Got it. And it's starting to link up to what Denise is saying about the co-creation of a healing story for someone. But I don't want to go there right now. What I wondered, Joel, if you don't mind, is I'd love to ask Molly, look, all this research you did on audio tapes of people practicing motivational interviewing, were there surprises on that journey for you?
It's a hard question to answer because I feel like there's a lot of surprises and I could easily get into the weeds. But what I would say is that, like I said, with the psychodynamic theory, you can get a fair amount of sort of proof of concept around the theoretical model from the research. You can also get a fair amount of heartbreak because it's very difficult to put a statistical lens onto a human process. If I were going to come up with surprises, they would be around sort of those nuances and those exceptions. Maybe these just little cool tidbits that come particularly, well, I would say some come from analyzing the data and some come from just listening to the sessions. An example of one from listening to the sessions is we come up with a term that we call sneaky advice, right? Our coders there, sneaky advice. And this is, the act of, have you considered talking to your partner about removing the alcohol from the fridge, right? So, like asking a question or doing, ways that sort of advice bleeds into the conversation, but the person who has been very well trained and is monitored in motivational interviewing knows that they're not supposed to do. And yet that they can't help themselves. Which gets back to Denise's first point about changing the therapist and so
Yeah,
forth.
yeah,
But yeah,
yeah.
so that's sort of one example of like, this is a really cool tidbit that I'm going to remember and I'm going to think about when I train therapists, or, you know, yeah, it's not something that I've found like, oh, this predicts worse outcomes or anything, but, you know, yeah, so that's one example.
And looking back at all this research you've done and all these tapes you've listened to, how comfortable do you feel about what's come out of it all? Well, put it this way, if you had to redo the whole thing, right, with the benefit of hindsight now.
Well, I'm also monitoring the chat. And there's Sinead Anderson said, do you think some sneaky advice can be helpful? And I do just kind of want to touch on that because I feel like it loops back to the conversation around confrontation. And it loops back to Joel's point around, well, like if you do it at high spirit, it's okay. If you do it at low spirit, it's not okay. I mean, that's, you know, in statistics, that's called moderation. And, you know, that's one of the perils of research, is that we're trying to average across all these different people and come up with a single rule. And that's just impossible, right? And so we do try and come up with ways to parse out, well, for this person it's helpful and that person it's not helpful. And so I would say, you know, sneaking advice certainly could be helpful depending on the context, just like confrontation could be helpful depending on the context. And by context, I mean, you know, the way things are going in the moment, the personality of the client, and the relationship between the therapist and the client.
Yeah, I
Let's
really
say that.
Yeah, and Natalie and Sinead, I really feel that skillful advice giving can be merged seamlessly with motivational interviewing.
Yeah, I mean, as an example, my father was sick with cancer. He has passed away, but his doctor was like doing really novice motivational interviewing. And, you know, my dad was just like, what? You know, just tell me what to do. You know, like there's this whole, like, you know, your cancer doctor is like, well, what do you think? It's like, my dad's like, no, what do you think, Mr. Anyway. So if I were to do it over again, I wouldn't. Actually, I really just would hope that we could continue on this journey in the research, because research is really, really hard. Process research is extra hard. And so we really just need time to, you know, work through a lot of the nuance and the details. I think the support is decent. And I think decent is the best you can hope for. And so I feel optimistic, and I would keep going. I don't know that I would change anything, or, you know, yeah, I like the model. I like the methods. So I just say we stick at it, because we have to recognize that this is an uphill battle, and that we are, you know, really trying to make sense of a very complicated thing that has a lot of variability from person to person, situation to situation.
And so then the confrontational question the question that I confronted Denise with, do you really think it is as simple as creating a helpful space for people to articulate why and how they want to change? And that's called change talk, and it leads to better outcome. Do you because that suggests like quite a simple linear guideline. Do you really think it's as simple as that?
I think that it is not as simple as that. And that is one central pathway through which change occurs. It is, you know, I go back right to the book and Bem's, you know, the citation of Bem's self-perception theory, the idea of talking yourself into change. You can measure that. What it looks like is it looks like a linear slope of the occurrence of change talk over a course of a session, a negative slope in the occurrence of sustained talk. That is potentially a marker of explored and resolved ambivalence. And that is one really great explanation with decent support. And I believe there are others. And that the applicability of those few explanations are going to vary by people,
Oh, what?
you know,
They
and
will?
hopefully we could identify those groups of people, but obviously we won't totally be able to.
So these other explanations, Molly, I want to come back to that with you, but I'm concerned that we give Joel a chance to contribute, let alone move on to chatting to Colin. But I want to come back to some of those other explanations, because that's why we put this word hope loosely into the title of this webinar. You know, where does offering hope come in? And what's harmful? So I think we'll come back to that, if you don't mind, Molly and Denise. And Joel, if you want to,
Yeah.
if you want, then could you take us forward and maybe have a chat to Colin?
Yeah. No, I mean, well, the interesting thing for me is kind of sitting back and listening. In my head, I'm going a million directions. And, you know, Molly, I didn't know your background was in brief psychodynamic therapy. And I'd be really interested in how you see MI working within that model. You know, that's a conversation about change, but that's one place I'm going in my head. And then when you asked this question about, is it that linear? And I remember having a conversation with Bill Miller in Poland, I think it was. And I said, you know, Bill, I think motivational interviewing is just evidence-based common sense. And he kind of looked at me in that odd way he does when I have conversations with him. And I said, you know, people talk positively about change, it predicts that they're going to change. People talk negatively about change, it predicts they might not change. And if you can create this environment that you're talking about, Steve, this empathic environment, people are going to be more inclined to open up. But I don't think it's as simple as that either. I think there's too many unknowns about why and when people decide to make significant changes in their life. And I agree with Denise that language is a good marker for that. At least it gives us feedback of how the conversation is going in that moment.
Could I say one quick thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad.
Which is just that I think a good example of that it's not always going to work that way is folks on the higher end of severity and folks who have an extensive treatment history, because you're going to get the most amazing change talk, super insightful. It's all the things that we might hope to tell them. And it's not necessarily going to predict their outcome.
Absolutely.
And so that is what, you know, and that, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
No, and I agree that point, because one of the things that Colin, I would like for you to come in after this. One of the things that I think about is that, you know, is that when you do get these continuum of severity, you know, the people that are on that far end, particularly in drug and alcohol and complexity with mental health issues and the severity of their substance use, MI is kind of a helpful way to get a conversation going that's going to take a long time.
Right.
So, and I know that Colin's been around the drug and alcohol world for a long time, and the MI world a long time, and he and I have had lots of conversations about this. So I'm really interested in what your thoughts are at this point in this conversation we're having.
Yeah, it's a fascinating conversation, and like you, Joel, I've gone in a million different directions in my mind since we started. I think, I mean, for me, in some ways, it is that simple, because it is. We can measure it and we can see it, and when this happens, this tends to happen, and we've got very good research around that. But the whys of that is a little bit more what goes on under the bonnet, and I think there's a lot happening there. So I think, you know, what we're talking about is what predicts positive treatment outcomes, or what predicts behavioral change. We get very obsessed with the clinical conversations because that's the business that we're in. But of course, lots of people change without any conversation whatsoever or any professional intervention. So there's a lot happening there too. And we don't tap into that as much because that's kind of outside of our field. So there are lots of things that do predict change. But when somebody comes into the clinical scenario where they're sitting in front of us and we're having a conversation, well, then there's key indicators that we look for. And we can start to stack that up and figure out obvious ones like accurate empathy is a very, very strong predictor of positive treatment outcome. But again, there's a dynamic between a clinician or a therapist or a healthcare professional and a client. And traditionally, I think we're probably more inclined to think about attributing treatment resistance to the client rather than the interpersonal dynamic, and we're getting better at that in more recent times. But certainly something that does seem to be happening, which is the sub-theme of this conversation, is what happens when we consider the expectation or the anticipation of the clinician in these conversations, and what we know the clinicians are pretty good at predicting what treatment outcomes will look like. What we don't know so much, and we're probably a little bit under-researched on, is why that's the case. And is it a predictive insight that clinicians tend to have, or is it an influential expectancy? So our treatment providers actually influencing treatment outcomes by their expectations and all the nuances around that, whether it filters into conversation or whether it filters into to physical cues of body language and so on. But that's difficult to separate, but I certainly suspect that is absolutely happening. And I think if that's true, then we really need to think about training clinicians to master that, because I think that's a skill and a choice as much as it is a disposition. We all probably sit on a continuum of pessimism and optimism, but also we have a choice in terms of how we deliberately apply that in clinical practice. Sorry, Steve.
Could I interrupt you, Colin, and ask you, can you
Please
clarify a little bit what you mean by mastering it?
The ability to change our where we are from an optimistic versus pessimistic position in relation to what we expect our clients to do next. I sit in regular clinical meetings, multidisciplinary clinical meetings, where we talk about our clients, we talk about assessments, we talk about ongoing treatment and so on. And sometimes when we hear clinicians talk pessimistically about clients, it's a difficult situation, because we know that the evidence is probably telling us that that is having an influence on the outcome. So what do we do? And I think in supervision and in training, we should be trying to master the ability to be able to make a choice about how we convey optimism, how we convey hope in a clinical conversation, even if we don't necessarily feel it.
Wow. And I can see Denise nodding her head. And the last time we had one of these webinars, Denise described a workshop on hope. Is that correct, Denise? Could you tell us what that was about?
Actually, we, Stephanie Wahab and I we've done it a couple times now, an all-day workshop on cultivating hope and growing hope in ourselves and our clients. And it was based on the work that Colin sort of referenced there, that there is our ability to be hopeful and carry hope for our clients is associated with outcomes, and how hard it is sometimes to maintain hope. There's situations, just as Colin was recognizing, sometimes it's really difficult. So we focused the workshop on part of the time on how a clinician fuels their hope, and how we as both people and clinicians are able to tap into refill our reservoir, if you will, to be able to be in that space where you can provide hope. And then we had practices in different ways of how you can cultivate hope in clients, whether it's focusing on strengths or focusing on successes they've had in the past, but some strategies like that. So we kind of approached it from both ways. And what I will say is that the conversations that we had about sharing about what kinds of things actually give us hope, what we place our own hope in, were so powerful. It was a really powerful workshop in that way, because people were able to tap into their own hope and figure out where it's sat and how they might be able to use it. As Colin said, how can you employ hope and find it when you're not sure it's there?
Almost like you were clarifying some universal truths for both the therapist and the client.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and I mean, for me, is based on the belief that goes all the way back to what Rogers said, of trusting that it is there, trusting that the hope is there, that there is a path, that people will grow, can grow, and we've taught that all along. Like, you have to be able to do that in order to be able to do motivational interviewing. You have to be able to tap that and trust that. But it can be really hard to do in the face of a lot of the work that people are facing, and the challenging clients and the challenging situations, and not to mention the pandemic. But it's like, it can be really challenging to do that.
I think that's really true, because there's definitely a journey between the client and the positive treatment outcome, and I think, not to sound too flowery about it, but I think we could nearly put more effort into believing in their ability to make that journey rather than what we do to get them there.
Yeah. And the notion, I mean, and that this has been a part of motivational interviewing, but also some other writings that Bill Miller has done over the years in different things about being able to also lend hope, like how important it is to be able to lend hope to people who are feeling hopeless, and until they can hold hope themselves, until they can reference it.
Yeah.
One of the things,
you mentioned the word motivational interviewing almost once in the last 5-7 minutes. Either you or Colin, and I'm finding that very interesting, because it sounds like you are inviting a different way of looking at a conversation about change. I'm not saying it's incompatible with MI. It just feels to me like you're looking at it through a slightly different lens. I wonder what you make of that. I mean, where would it leave researchers like Molly? If Molly was now going to kind of take on board what Denise and Colin have been talking about, where would Molly start? She wouldn't start with looking at tapes and defining and counting change talk. She'd be concerned with measuring hope. And from my recent revelations about what we've been doing and writing up about motivational interviewing, we've worshipped on the altar of reflective listening because it evokes change talk. But seeing through the lens of what you're describing, affirmation is a very powerful way of evoking hope. So that's what I wanted.
Patrick brought this up in the chat, but because there's another piece of this that does get measured, which is the client self-exploration measure. And I would say you can measure things like the expression of hope by both the clinician, but also by the client, and that there's evidence out there that supports that the language of self-exploration is also connected to outcome. We don't have all the details, but it is connected to the outcome, and it's been utilized for many years. But it is the training, and it was developed to train people to recognize those signs. What are a person's hopes, and be able to do it. And I don't know about you, Molly, but from listening, clients give you evidence of this. And Colin, they give evidence of their hopes and dreams and what they value all the time.
You do. I'm sorry to be so domineering, Joel. If you can just let me just rant a little bit, and then I promise I'll calm down a bit here.
Go on, man.
But look, it's maybe not that complicated, because like the other day, I saw, this was in elite soccer, okay? I saw, like a couple of hours before the big game against Liverpool, I saw a coach leaning against a fence with a player, right? And all I heard the player say was, no, I'm feeling really shit today, coach. Right now, then they had a conversation for 5-10 minutes. Then this player went out and played against Liverpool and was brilliant, right? And they won the game. And the Liverpool players were all hugging him, this opposition guy at the end to say congratulations. And when we walked back, I said to him, hey, that conversation that you had with a coach this morning, what was that about? And he just said, oh, he always does that to me. He always turns my bad day around into a good day. Now, if Molly had, and Denise looked at the audio tape of that conversation, I think you'd find it difficult to escape confirming Colin's hypothesis that this is about actually listening to the guy and conveying hope. Anyway, I came away from that experience thinking, wow, that coach is doing something very special. And he knows nothing about motivational interviewing. He knows a lot about evoking hope in someone. I don't know, was that rant in any way useful?
I mean, I think that you could do that research, and that you're right that yes, you would pay attention to things occurring in the session, but I personally would be very interested in, you know, some basic self-report measures on the therapist. I mean, I think back on I think the story was with, you know, the seminal alcohol RCT project match, that Bill Miller was screening therapists based on their level of empathy, I believe, in order to select them.
I remember.
To deliver the motivational enhancement therapy. And so it, you know, the capacity for hope, the psychological health of the therapist, the psychological health of the setting, those are things that you can measure and probably would go very far in predicting the therapist's capacity to communicate those things in a moment that are often very just about energy, really, and not even words. When you were talking about confrontations earlier, it's like the feeling, the therapist's feelings behind the confrontation matter, right? Is the therapist frustrated? Is the therapist thinking that this person is going to lie and cheat and steal like every other person? That's a very different confrontation than, you know, like an edgy, very cool personality kind of person that knows how to push the envelope in a way that is very sort of engaging. And
that's what the coach did.
Yeah.
You see, that's what that soccer coach did. It's exactly right. And lest we fall into the temptation of developing a new therapy called hope therapy, which I hope and pray nobody even goes near there, please. Can I remind us that, like, Jerome Frank in the 60s wrote a book called Persuasion and Healing. That, for those of you that don't know it, it's really well worth glancing through, because I don't think there's anything we've discussed that isn't compatible with what Jerome Frank was saying.
The guy that came up with the dodo bird hypothesis, even he was talking about that. And that was like 1936.
Wow.
Talking about like the power of expectancies, and talking about the purpose of the sort of the rationale or the frame that is placed around the therapy, and how that really matters in predicting outcomes.
Yeah. Whatever complex explanation the therapist or counselor might have for why they're doing what they're doing, actually these fundamental processes cut across all forms of helping and healing.
I think that's my observation just coming in. It's at one level, like, I'm blown away by the level. Like, I realize I'm playing in a different league, right? I mean, this is a league above mine.
No, it's not, Rick.
But I'm sitting there thinking, desperately trying to find this cause-effect relationship, and I'm sitting there thinking, at one level, it just feels quantum. It feels so difficult to try and find. Whether there's something around what is that artful human interaction, and to Denise's point, is it something about the head, or is it something about the heart? Do we create it? Is it an intuitive space? So actually, we've got to unlearn some of the bullshit that we've attached to things, and actually suddenly come back to ourselves. And to Colin's point, is that where we find the empath, because we've got the person working on their own stuff? So actually, I can come into a conversation as clean as I can possibly be, and therefore act as a most effective mirror. But I've come through with that positive space because it's clean within me. so that actually someone can then take that hope, take that lift and play from there. Because I get slightly overwhelmed by going, holy shit, is it, what am I saying? What am I thinking? I wonder whether we can overthink this stuff. And actually at one level, it's a really artful sense of our true essence.
Wow. And Rick, tell us a bit about what you've been up to, eh?
Yeah, so my research work is exploring the athletic journey, if you like. So it's trying to look at what happened post-retirement for athletes. So the change I'm looking at is you go from identity as an elite athlete, which has a whole stack of defining principles about how we judge success, how we relate to the external validation of sport, of performance, and of achievement. And it's beginning to unpick some of that and what might it be to change that identity, to drop some of those old habits. So trying to look really around, and that's why I think that interesting piece that Colin mentioned about to what extent is it, can we build this sense of positive self-regard, positive self-compassion? Because so much of that change may be being driven by negative self-talk. I'm not good enough, I'm not able, I'm not able to do those things. So really trying to build the part of the puzzle I think will unlock a lot of the work for the athletes I work with, is creating that internal hope, creating that positive self-talk.
Wow.
That then unpicks, because I think so many people are kind of almost Pavlovian. They're not aware of what's triggered them before they've done it. So it's almost trying to unpick what happens so that they can actually begin to respond in a different way. So I think MI has a definite role in terms of trying to play those. How do we create that safe environment, that incredible environment where people can actually articulate the experience they want to have?
Yep.
So one of the things that Molly said early on, and that I've been thinking about for the last while, and even as Rick was talking, is that I remember one of the sacred cows of counseling is you're not supposed to be working harder than your clients. And I've always wrestled with that, particularly with people who are really stuck or have very little hope. Right. And so I wonder how that fits into a conversation about change, about who's doing the work. And I remember people saying, it sounds like you're working harder than your client. And I understood it intellectually, but on an emotional level, it didn't make sense to me, because it's a relationship that we're in. And sometimes, one person has to work a little harder than the others. So I'm wondering how this fits into that, whether you're in a coaching situation, a counseling situation, or a teaching situation. Who's doing all the work, and does it really matter? That's my question.
We've kind of touched off that a few times now. Where does that hope sit, and what is the seat of hope in the interpersonal dynamic of a therapeutic relationship? And it has to be responsive to both. And I think, as Molly and Denise were saying, if you can probably evaluate it, but where do you evaluate it? And I think it has to be evaluated on both and within the discourse, because people, if we just look at it from a client perspective in a clinical conversation, they come to these scenarios because they've lost some hope. They've at least lost the hope in their ability to do something on their own, and hand themselves over to somebody. And if they experience more hopelessness reflected back at them, you've just got two people sitting in quicksand. So where one doesn't have it, the other has to have it, if it's to be in any way effective. So I think the imperative again is on the clinician to be able to find ways to access hope, as Denise said earlier on, going back to Rogers, to be able to find something in somebody that they can't find in themselves. So I think that interpersonal dynamic is a really key area where this plays out.
There's this feeling I'm beginning to get that we're in an echo chamber where we're agreeing about a lot of things. And then when I listen to this conversation and I imagine trying to teach or write about this stuff for folk so that they can put this into practice, I just shudder, let alone what a fear of how on earth somebody like Molly will begin to study this. Because if you let people loose with this idea of hope, they think it's about praising and encouraging people. It's what you're describing is something quite deep and quite some distance from, oh, don't worry, you can see the tendency to reassure someone. Don't worry, there's lots of hope there. You can see injecting hope, cajoling people with hope, and yet you're talking about something a little bit subtler. And I'm wondering, beyond what Jerome Frank was talking about, what kind of scaffolding we can possibly put on this and how compatible that is with motivational interviewing. But I'm not suggesting we answer that, but I'm just sharing an observation with you. Molly, why are you?
I have a thought, which is really like came from the last podcast, and the conversation around motivational interviewing changes the therapist more than the client, which when I heard that, I was like, what? Like really inspirational to think about it in those terms. And I recently had an experience where I was talking at a smart recovery conference, and they really wanted me to talk a lot about the writing reflex. And so bringing those two things together, I mean, it's really like just thinking about the ego of the therapist and how much what we do as therapists is motivated by our own egos and needs. We want to feel helpful. We want to feel smart. We want to use the tools we've learned. And so I think just some hard self-reflection around that. I watching Bill Miller with Soccer Mike, which don't even get me started on Soccer Mike. He triggers me, but like Bill Miller just seems really zen. And I think there's something about that, really, that a zen place of acceptance and connection toward the person and not toward our own needs to feel like we're helping them or stop the experience from being uncomfortable because they're suffering. I think there's a lot of work that could occur there. I mean, speaking personally, I think, and that's something that is talked about certainly, but how do we really create a sort of a training science around that?
Yeah. And measure some of the approximations to what you're talking about. You're not sure.
How to measure it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would take some thought.
One of the things, one of the things that you brought up, Molly, was the energy that's being the energetic interaction between the client and the therapist, or the person and the helper. And one of the things, one of the things in motivational interviewing is about talk time and who's talking the most. And you want to share the floor with the client, if not them speaking more than you over time. And I'm wondering how you'd measure that energetic exchange, because I would think that that's pretty important, because it's not just the words that we use, as you were saying, it's how we convey those words and how you would measure that, because it could sound very generic or it could sound really genuine in a Rogerian kind of world. Because you could say, oh, client says this, and my response is, just a generic response about hope. But I wonder how you'd pick that up. How would, if it's important, and I tend to think it is, particularly in motivational interviewing, how we express empathy. I think that's a key ingredient or mechanism of action in motivational interviewing. But some people are more empathic than others, and they convey that, verbally and non-verbally. So how would you measure this stuff? that seems to be important. But you can't count it.
There are some, you know, from communication science and stuff. There are some measurement processes that you can use to kind of pick up on tone and that kind of stuff. But I think you're absolutely right. The tone and the severity. Even simple affirmations of like a good job, the difference between, oh, you did a good job and you really did a great job on that, are really different. They have completely different, you know, the significance that you carry in your tone. And I've been wanting to send all the people that I train to have voice lessons to learn how to use their voice as a tool, because it's so easy to just throw it out there, and the pacing and all of that stuff are really important ways that you convey that. But you can hear it when you listen.
Yes.
You can hear the difference in the tone and the pace. And there are some ways of, you know, more qualitative measurement tools for doing that. But of course, they take a lot of time and effort to
So do
measure.
you think it's possible that really all that motivational interviewing is a set of guidelines and a scaffold for helping these therapists become, or counselors or helpers become, more self-aware, more self-reflective, and get out of the way in a collaborative conversation in which somebody heals themselves? And the processes that we've been talking about can operate naturally, and motivational interviewing provides that scaffold. So we don't need to develop hope therapy as a distinct effort, because
I think
sounds
there is one out there, actually.
don't tell me. Hey, listen, I'm just wondering whether we've got 20 minutes to go, Joel, and there are some wonderful people in the audience.
Yeah, let's bring them on.
Would you like me to invite someone, or should we make it a free form? Is Jeff Allison there? Would he like to just identify himself? He doesn't even need to.
I don't see Jeff logged on.
He's not there. Okay. I suspect he's watching, and he's keeping a low profile, which is fair enough. It's going to take some effort to bring him on.
We have well, Alan Zweven's with us, and Dave Rosengren's always has some great things to say.
Well,
And Margot
if you look at the chat column, David's made a couple of very interesting references to Lynn Johnson's work, and then also something which struck me very hard, as it would to Rick, which is that I'm going to let David explain it. Barbara Fredrickson's work that says that the only positive emotion where you don't need psychological safety as a precondition is hope. And I'm sure Rick's going to start twitching, because Rick's very modest. He's an international level sportsman, and he and I have seen in elite sport how the conveying of hope in situations where people are not feeling safe is actually very powerful. So I can see what David's getting at here. And I wonder whether, oh, there he is. David?
Yeah, hey, sorry, didn't. Very interesting conversation, y'all. So yeah, I think Barbara Fredrickson's comment is just a really interesting one. She's looking at the value of positive emotions more generally. How can they help us? And I do think that this is an underappreciated part of what we do in motivational interviewing, is we start to shift some of these negative emotions into more positive frames. But the reason why hope is so powerful is what you just articulated, Steve, and that is that it is the one positive emotion where you don't need to have psychological safety as a precondition. So I know that's part of what folks work for in a motivational interviewing context, but in, like you were saying, that in a sport context with this individual is having the crap day, and the coach comes in and is able to shift that conversation in a way that shifts his outlook to a more hopeful one, then the possibility of a different sort of performance comes about. I would say, I would make the argument that it's probably the same thing that happens in the course of a match or a game, where suddenly a team that's been down shifts the momentum, is that there's been a shift in hope that happens. Something happens that allows them to see an opportunity they didn't see before. And then suddenly what's going on in the course of that game is shifted by that internal thing that's gone on. So I don't think we want to do hope therapy, but Steve, I think you may be setting up straw people there and knocking them down when you're talking about hope as being somehow separate. I think it's fully integrated into what it is we do. And we've just used models that look at particular ways of assessing outcomes, and we may need to shift our models a little bit to see what else is there. And that's all I have to say about that.
And would you
Actually, for me, elaborate on what you mean by hope is the one positive emotion that doesn't need psychological safety, or that's not a precondition.
Mm-hmm. So what Fredrickson would say is that positive emotions, things like amusement, joy, peace, some of those kinds of positive emotions that people have, those all require for people to feel safe in their environment before they can experience those things. So it's part of why amusement can sort of help to shift a circumstance that's a little uncertain, that, you know, if we feel some safety, we start to laugh, we feel comfortable and safe. Hope doesn't necessarily require that the person feels safe in order to feel that hope there.
I find that, why not?
It's a really good question. I would say she's the expert there. I don't know. I'm just following what her research has had to say. But I think that's probably a question for Colin, because that's part of what Colin was talking about in terms of some of the people he's working with.
Colin?
Well, I was actually reading some of the questions. Sorry, what was the question?
The question was, why isn't safety required for hope, if I'm getting that right, Molly? Why is it required for other sorts of positive emotions, but not for hope? And I was saying, in the context of the work that you're doing, you've obviously observed that process. So I'm curious what you think about why that might not be necessary for hope.
Yeah, and I'm not sure why it even would be, because and it's probably similar for sport in a way. I think if you have an expectation that something is going to go in a particular way, that's either hopeful or it's hopeless. And I think Molly, you brought up the example of the soccer guy earlier on. It was a very interesting dynamic, because one of the conversations after that, if you saw the interview with Bill Miller and the panel, I was something expressed along the lines of, well, you know, this must have been difficult because there was a lot of pessimism coming from this guy. I'm not sure if it was pessimism, but something along those lines. And he was kind of confused by the question. He was, well, I actually didn't see that much pessimism. I saw more optimism. And it's just having a different lens in a way that just allows you to see things in a slightly different way. And I think Bill was just, it was kind of primed in that way. And I think motivational interviewing probably came through that lens in many ways, but just having that natural inclination to see the possibility and to see the potential and to see and to believe in and to trust, as Denise was saying earlier on, people's inclination towards that positive outcome, and then to be more likely to facilitate it through the experience of hope. So rather than what we do and how we actually demonstrate it, needing to have it in the first instance.
That was one of my questions, is what's the best thing to study? Is it to study the therapist or the coach, or to study what the therapist or coach does? They seem slightly different things.
Probably both.
And how do we know which one is having the biggest impact?
Right.
That is a fabulous question, Rick.
Yes, it is.
And I don't know the answer to it, but I love that you posed the question.
I was told to bring in a whoosh from left field. I think I may have just done it.
I would say both and.
Okay.
You know, in their new book on the effective counseling skills or that include hope, but they talk about there's to all of those ways. There's a way of being and a way of doing, and that both are important. So being able to be hopeful, to fuel your own hope, to keep that going, and to be able to convey that and work with the client's hope too. So both, it's like one without the other doesn't really do much. You need both the way of being and the way of doing, would be my.
Well, Steve, one of the things that you tossed out in one of our conversations is that when you, as you and Bill are kind of writing about motivational interviewing, is that you're looking at kind of the spirit and you're thinking about empowerment as part of the spirit. And I'm wondering where hope fits underneath that umbrella of empowerment. Is creating hope an empowering thing for a person? Is that one way to bring hope into the motivational interviewing conversation through empowerment?
Certainly feels relevant. And someone in the chat box mentioned the word faith. Certainly feels relevant, Joel. Yeah, it does. But I'm having real difficulty in getting away from the clarity of Jerome Frank's writing in the 60s about persuasion and hope and healing. It's just striking me. You look here, there's many years of experience here in helping conversations in this group, and sounds like there's some truths that we are clarifying that get right to the heart of what it is to be healing. And I find Denise's account of what Miller and Moyers did in that book very helpful. You know, it's both a way of being. It's about how and what you do. It's both. So I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. It probably means that I don't have much more to say. Margot says this book is fantastic, and I must confess I haven't read it. But if somebody could put the name of the book in the chat column, that might be really useful.
So I was thinking about hopeless situations, and I have a colleague in Singapore, and he's a psychologist. He's a Buddhist psychologist, and his I don't know if Commu's still doing this, but what he was doing was he was working with the men who were on death row for trafficking drugs into Singapore. And many of these men had been persuaded or tricked to do this by drug dealers. And they know what the minimum amount is to get the death penalty in Singapore. And they would go to the villages in Malaysia and Indonesia, and they'll tell these young men will give you $500 US if you carry this suitcase into Singapore, and then you can come home. So that's more money than they would have ever seen. So they give the guy the bag, the suitcase with the heroin or cocaine or whatever it was in it, usually heroin, and they dob him in to the authorities. And while the authorities are busy arresting this guy, they have another guy with a bigger load coming around the end, escaping it. So here you have a young man who's on death row in Singapore for trafficking drugs that he may or not have even known that's what he was doing. And Camus would say that he described it as probably one of the most hopeless clinical scenarios I could see, other than reading, Viktor Frankl's writings and other people's writings around that. Is it, how do you instill hope where it's a terminal outcome and somebody is feeling really done hard by life? I don't know that there's an answer, but it makes me kind of curious about where does hope fit in. And what Camus told me, as I asked him, well, what kind of change happens. And he says, well, sometimes it's just being with these men and showing that I care is all I can do, and listen to them. Because, you know, unless there's a spiritual level of instilling hope, there is no hope. They're not going to get out. They can't afford the attorneys and from overseas, and they're going to get executed.
Oof.
So where does hope fit into these kind of scenarios? How important is it, and what can we do when it comes into our professional worlds like this?
Well, it begs the question, hope in what? So for those guys, it's not hope in getting out of that scenario or circumnavigating the that outcome, but it might be hope for other things, such as how they survive it and what things they do before that time, and maybe it depends on what we have hope in. Similar to motivational interviewing, we talk about directional change. What is it? What is that change outcome that we're both speaking about? That's an agreement that we kind of have in place in order to do the work.
Right.
Well, it's also existential, right? There's an element of hope that is existential, that is about, you know, inherent worth, belonging. And so those human moments with that person could potentially go a long way in that regard. Just being seen as a human being.
Mm.
And,
Hey,
and
just-
part of the, go ahead, Steve.
No, I'm just noticing one thing we have not talked about all evening, which maybe isn't a bad thing, but is conversations about change that are harmful.
I
Yeah.
remember in a mighty motivational interviewing treatment integrity skill code training that Denise had here in Christchurch. And we were talking about the scales, the global scales. And it's going to be hard not to be technical here, Steve. But you're measuring things like empathy and partnership. And I remember Denise said, if you move below 3, you're probably causing harm. And that was profound to me. If you're moving up, below 3, you're probably causing harm. And I've never quite thought of it that way. And I didn't ask you in that training, but do you still think that, Denise? And can you unpack that a little bit? What do you mean by causing harm?
Well, so it specifically relating to empathy, that that there's been some work, and actually Bill and Terry, of course, put out that article too. Is low empathy toxic? And when they looked at the across I think it was in they might have even used match data, but when they looked at therapists who were not able to express empathy, so they divided up the by therapists, not by site or anything like that. They looked at the people who had low empathy, and the conclusion they came to is people would have been much better to stay home and not come, because oftentimes when people were in a relationship with someone who was not able to express empathy, their outcomes were worse. So that idea that you can, if we know that empathy, particularly empathy, is really related to outcomes, we have a pretty good idea that if it's not there, it can be harmful. They'd be better off without it, for sure.
Sounds to me like this is the subject of a future webinar. My only hesitation is that poor Denise is going to be dragged back for the 3rd time.
There are others who are more able to talk to that particular thing too.
Well, I'll probably take guidance from you, Denise, but you know, there's something also about the ego of the practitioner, if you like. I've noticed this in conversations among lay people, that when somebody's ego gets involved, I suppose it's just one way of describing what you're saying. So there might be different ways of looking at harm. I just know for sure from my everyday life and seeing the way people in states of hopelessness, go and seek help. And it just is not a good experience.
If you just get in there and wallow with them about the hopelessness and sort of collude with the hopelessness, as from my perspective, that does harm.
There you go. So it's not just a matter of being insensitive. In a way, you can be over sensitive.
Very sensitive, but not be able to reframe it at all or help move it out.
And that takes us right back to the beginning of this discussion where you
Yes,
opened
it
the
does.
discussion with a point about focus, which is very interesting, Denise, and extremely helpful. Now, look, Rick's had to leave us, and some of us have thanked him, and I think that was really helpful to have him with us. And we've reached the end. But Denise, that's a very interesting point on which to end, which is that it sounds like helpfulness involves having a focus where someone can grow to become more hopeful. And the privilege for us of holding back and stepping back and being a privileged witness of that is a treasure.
Well, not only being a privileged witness, but a privileged participant in the conversation.
Sure.
And how we carry ourselves in the conversation, particularly around communication. You're bearing witness, but also you're participating, because I'm the one who's trying to instill the hope, or trying to kindle the hope in the process.
Super. Now look, we're bang on time, and we've got a tradition of just hanging about for a short while in case there's somebody who also wants to come on. But from this point onwards, this conversation is decidedly informal. I don't know whether that means Angela stops the recording.
We keep going.
Oh, do you? Well, then I can't eat my supper, which is uneaten in front of me. So, but I can't be rude, you see. But listen, can I say to Colin, Molly, and Denise, thank you so much. It's been a super rich discussion, isn't it?
Yeah. Thanks, Rick too, and everybody else. And it's always great to see Colin and Denise, longtime friends, and it's nice to see you again, Molly. Now, since we're out of the hope conversation, Molly, can you tell me a little bit about your thoughts of brief psychodynamic therapy and motivational interviewing, and how they come together? Because I know you have limited time left, or blending them together. Because years ago, there was an article about psychoanalytic therapy and motivational interviewing written by someone in the UK. But I'd be real interested in your thoughts from a researcher practitioner perspective.
I think there's similarities and differences.
Yeah.
And it gets back to what can we do that is, I'm a common factors proponent, and I'm very interested in psychotherapy equivalence. So the idea that if you take two evidence-based treatments and you put them in a clinical trial against each other, they're often, not always, but they're going to have similar results. They're going to be moderately effective, and they're going to be similarly effective. And so you then say, well, why? Right. And so one explanation could be that they're doing different things that are equally effective. And so we could think about, because I was studying short-term dynamic psychotherapy. It has a strong experiential component. It's got a lot of Gestalt techniques. It's a highly integrative therapy. So it has a lot of cognitive techniques, but it has a lot of experiential techniques. And, I certainly believe in the value of those types of techniques. I get really annoyed when my therapist tries to do them with me, but I believe in their purpose. And MI is not necessarily doing that. I think there is an emotional exchange that comes from human connection. But there's not that same level of directiveness around experiential exercises. So really that new learning that occurs through experience, that in a dynamic therapy maybe would happen in a session, in a cognitive behavioral therapy, it would happen maybe via in a session, but also via like homework and stuff. Yeah, so, but there is also this change in perception. I mean, the self-exploration measure, right, that Denise was talking about, it's a measure of dynamic therapy, right? It measures dynamic therapy mechanisms. So yeah, so there are commonalities and there are also multiple routes to a single outcome. And so that change, maybe that changing self-perception, and then I'll stop myself because I don't want to be too long-winded, but like that changing self-perception of the self and of the other, is probably more proximal to the outcome than that co-creation conversation or that emotional experiencing in session, right? That's probably, one step in a causal chain, and then the attitudes and the feelings and the thoughts change. And then that is more related to symptoms and, those outcomes that we pay the most attention to. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I would say that there are some similarities and some differences, with the key difference being that experiential component as being such an active mechanism in those types of therapies, as opposed to motivational interviewing or narrative therapy, or maybe acceptance and commitment therapy that have a lot more of a cognitive emphasis combined with a relational emphasis. And that relational emphasis is definitely going to also have like a direct arrow to outcomes, changing self-perception, and so forth. I mean, and one other thing I'll say is just that there's another big difference is about the therapist driving the bus, right? So in dynamic therapies, in short-term dynamics, stay focused on the particular model that I was studying and learning. The therapist is very directive and very, holding you to task, raising your discomfort, things that we definitely don't see in a motivational interview.
Yeah. Okay. No, that answered my question very, very nicely, comprehensively. No, that's cool. What else? Anybody else have anything? Anybody from the audience want to come on and share their reflections?
Well, there was so much stuff that came up in the chat.
Yeah.
And I noticed Mike Porteous has been with us the whole time. Oh dear.
What are you going to say, Denise?
I was just going to say to build on Molly's, the reference to the self-exploration measure, which is it came out of Roger's students and Truax and Kharkov. They developed it, and we have it in the MISC, and I know Molly's used it too. But and finding things, but that shift in perception, I really try to teach people I work with about recognizing things that might lead to that. And I do believe that in motivational interviewing, when it really is, that at the more proficient levels, that you can facilitate that shift in perception. That experiential component, I encourage people to really look for evidence of that. It doesn't happen that often. Maybe it happens more often when you're more directive and you're actively trying to do it. But I do think it can happen.
What are some examples?
Can I say one thing about Denise's comment, which is that the shift in self-perception, I think it's pretty amazing, which is another surprise coming from tapes, which is that really happens in feedback reports. Like, who would have thought that feedback reports really would have been useful? I don't know. I didn't expect to hear what I have heard listening to sessions in terms of how people respond to personalized normative feedback, and particularly those comparisons of their, alcohol use, other drug use, something like that, as opposed to, similar population estimates. Wow. And you hear, because I'm not seeing them, a shift. an aha moment that is very much a product of information, as opposed to emotion, as opposed to experience. And I find that interesting.
Wow. I mean, there's absolutely no question that for Denise and Molly, your immersion in research has been hell of a helpful in informing not just your practice, but your training and your sense of reflections about yourself. It's amazing.
Well, and it extends beyond motivational interviewing too, because like what you're saying in terms of common factors, I think we're hovering around a lot of common factors in this conversation.
Yeah.
That are kind of trans approach. Yeah. Wow. Colin, do you have anything you want to add in?
I'm conscious not to take us off in another direction just before the end.
That's fine. That's fine.
I just one thought that had been occurring to me throughout the conversation is that one of the things that we've been speaking about is, I suppose, at least from the clinician's point of view, the clinician's confidence in the prospect of the client and the possibility of the client implementing successful change. But I think a key part of that is also the clinician's confidence in their own competence, and that's probably something that we need to pay attention to, both in supervision as well as training as well, because that has a byproduct of instilling hope into that interpersonal dynamic if the clinician is actually confident in what they're doing.
I get it.
Yeah, competence translates directly into good practice.
That's
for sure.
And confidence in the treatment there, or the what they're
Exactly.
doing. And there's evidence about that too, that having that and being able to convey that confidence to the people you're working with, that this is an effective treatment, and I do know how to do it, or what, to be able to convey that to the people you work with is not just have it, but share it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Neatly put.
Well, all right.
Well, it sounds like we nearing the end, aren't we?
Yeah, we might have just come to a natural ending here.
Yeah, we've missed quite a few people who've gone bye-bye who we could have roped in, but so that's okay. They could have joined us if they wanted to. Ange,
Yes.
have you got anything we've missed, or
Some of your reflections on the conversation?
I just think I think it's the universal application as someone laying on my learning counselling skills of some people's natural ability and how they can convey hope in conversations with others. And I think for those, and how it sparks off questions to me, what's a potentially helpful way of trying to convey hope or instill hope in others, and what's potentially harmful way. And I think it leads on to other conversations about, I think, yeah, just generally, I think the idea of hope is quite, you could write a book on it, I'm sure.
I'm sure you could. Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
I've learned a lot, so thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Ange.
Who's going to start the book?
Just finishing no book.
Uh,
Just finishing a book on deliberate practice, motivational interviewing and deliberate practice. So
oh, wow. I'll be looking forward to that one, Denise.
Really,
yeah,
Denise?
I think it's supposed to come out the first part of the year. Well, we're working on it for.
That'll have-
That's exciting news.
It's such a wonderful, I just recently got the cognitive behavioral therapy deliberate practice workbook, the APA. It's the same series.
Yes.
Such a great training tool, like just really nuts and bolts information.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, all right, people.
What a great group. Thank you all. What a great
Yeah.
group to participate with.
Yeah, well, we'll be in touch, and you know, it's been fantastic, and it's been a real treat to be with y'all and everybody who's attended. I just feel quite humbled by the whole thing. So anyway, until we meet again, Steve, I'll be talking to you later. Colin, I do hope to see you before too long. And as well, Denise and everybody else, you know. But it's been good. It's been good for me. Thank you very much for taking the
Thank
time.
you. Yeah, this was great. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Love it.
See
Bye.
ya.
Bye.